Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and I'm so grateful that you have joined us today. As we get closer to the 4th of July, we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. And, of course, there's a move right now to say, well, the Declaration of Independence didn't apply to me, so we need to do something else. And first of all, I would say that at the time, it probably only applied to people who could vote. And so those are male landowners. But over time, it was all sorts of individuals. It was eventually men and women, and eventually it was white, black, whatever it might be. But there is kind of a move to suggest that if we want to replace a holiday, it might be Christopher Columbus. Columbus Day might be fading out, and we end up with Juneteenth, which, again, I get such a smile on my face. A couple weeks ago, for sure, you could have said Juneteenth, and people would say, what? Maybe the state of Texas, we'd know what it was, but now all of a sudden that's going to be the great holiday. So we'll see whether that all goes. And there is a piece of legislation, actually sponsored by a couple of Republicans that have been on this program with us before, that actually are calling for the end of Columbus Day as a paid government holiday to be replaced by Juneteenth as a paid government holiday. I got an idea. Let's just have holidays, but not have them paid holidays, and let's everybody decide what they want to do with those. But that's another story for sure. We have a lot to cover over the next couple of hours. Tony Suarez will be with us the next hour. We'll be talking about the decision by the Supreme Court on what is called DACA, and we'll get into the whole issue of immigration and how to think about that. He has been, in one way or another, sometimes supportive of the president, other places disagreed with him, so I thought he'd be a good individual, and serves as kind of the chief operating officer for the National Hispanic Christian Leadership, which is a great organization. We've talked about, of course, with other members of that as well. And before we're all done, in the last hour, we're going to spend just an entire hour just kind of getting away from all the politics and all the issues. And Mitch Glaser actually will be with us as we talk about his new book that he edited with Darrell Bach, and that is Messiah in the Passover. Now, we're not at the Passover right now, but a book has come out. It's very well done. It's kind of a who's who of people that have actually written this. Mitch Glaser is the president of Chosen People Ministries, so I thought it would be just a great interview to do at the 2 o'clock hour, and then with the idea that if it really is a good one, we'll play it again. And we could play it this hour, because many of you might not have a chance to hear it, because we don't, on the local radio station, carry that hour. They decide to go somewhere else. And then, of course, as we get near Passover next year, probably want to play it again. So anyway, that's all just an overview of what's taking place. And I have a lot to cover in this hour before we get into some of these issues. But let's start with the biggest story if you're looking at the pandemic. That is, the cases actually exceeded 50,000 in a record single-day jump. Again, the United States reported more than 50,600 additional coronavirus cases on Wednesday, the largest single-day increase since the beginning of the outbreak. Cases were growing by 5% or more based on the change in average new cases compared with last week. And this is what's been taking place in about 40 states. For those of you, for example, that are watching online, I can show you a graphic illustration of what that looks like. And anybody watching right now online can see that we kind of went up to the kind of the peak. Just think about going over, I don't know, the Sierra Nevada in California, and then you're in Nevada and it's kind of going down a little bit, and then all of a sudden it goes back up again. And so when you look at this 7-day average, it has been going up precipitously. And so this is of real concern because, not only do we have an increase in the number of cases, but at least 80 new deaths, according to the data from Johns Hopkins University. And Arizona intensive care units now are at 89% of capacity. And, of course, Texas, we get different numbers depending on what part of the state you're talking about. So these are issues that I think are front and center. There are a number of attempts to try to maybe reverse some of the opening. We've got, for example, some of the indoor businesses are trying to close. This is, of course, restaurants, wineries, tasting rooms, movie theaters, family entertainment centers, and things like that. And then, of course, even in California, where, since I mentioned wineries, maybe think of California, has reported an additional 6,000 cases based on a 7-day rolling average. So that has been taking the case. Even in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced yesterday that the city will not allow restaurants to reopen their indoor dining sections as planned on July 6th, which would be on Monday. Now, there are some things that we can say about this, one of which, and I will get into maybe in the next hour because it's a very important issue, which is basically entitled Individual Actions Can Mitigate the Pandemic. So I want to get to that in just a minute, but I'm setting that aside simply to take you to the first article that we've posted on the website. And that is, people have said, well, this is a second wave. There are others. Timothy Carney, in particular, in his piece here, says, no, it's not really a second wave, just a differently timed wave rippling through a huge country. Again, recognize how large the United States is. If you've ever been in a car and driven from one end of the United States to the other, and I have done that, and I don't recommend it. Or even right now, since we're broadcasting the state of Texas, if you've driven from one end of Texas to the other, it takes a while. And so this is a big country with a lot of people, with a lot of diversity, and with some places where there's an incredible amount of population density, places where there are not. And so Timothy Carney puts it this way: it can seem like we're experiencing a second wave of the coronavirus, but there's lots of conflicting data. Case counts are rising, but some of that is due to testing. True. Importantly, deaths are not rising. Good. And then there are some parts of the charts that he has made available to us here where you can play games with the x-axis. Yeah, and that sometimes happens too, because if your goal is to say that this is a pandemic and this is the reason why Donald Trump needs to be thrown out of office and why we need to get Joe Biden in there, and I think some of the press certainly believe that, then, of course, they're going to play some games with some of those numbers as well. But what he's basically saying here is if you look at where some of the outbreaks are, it's not really a second wave. It's, if nothing else, a place that never really had much of a wave in the first place because of the lockdown. And, of course, then when you had some places where you had the hot spots, let's take New York City, he mentions Detroit and others, those outbreaks took place in March, and they're now tapering off. But in other places that avoided being a hot spot now, and Arizona, Florida, Texas are in the category there, we're seeing an increase. And some of that is due to all of the things we've mentioned, because I'm willing to be honest about that. There is some evidence that some of that came from the protests, although I've seen enough evidence now to suggest that that hasn't generated as much as some of the conservative groups would want to say. Some of it has happened simply because of the fact that people, as soon as they came out of lockdown, just started getting together in all sorts of parties and all sorts of bars and all sorts of various events. Some of it, as we might mention with Tony Suarez, because these three states, I should say, are kind of border states, come from some that may even have come from other countries like Mexico or Guatemala. So we'll talk about that. And when I come back, I want to, if nothing else, encourage you as we head to the 4th of July weekend, do some things that make some common sense. I'm going to talk about Alabama students right now throwing parties and then betting on who gets the coronavirus first. Don't be like them. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we approach the traditional time in America for which we celebrate its independence, it's worth considering two types of political society that we find in the world. The first is what we celebrate. We begin with the idea that government is instituted by human beings to provide liberty and security. We need enough government to ensure that we are safe, but we don't want so much government that we lose our freedom. Ben Shapiro talks about this in his editorial on our totalitarian moment. He explains that in this form of government, we agree not to infringe on another's life, liberty, and property, and we create a government capable of preventing or prosecuting such infringements. We may disagree with one another on key issues, but we allow the system of government to provide a means of resolving disputes. The second view requires purification. The goal is homogeneity instead of diversity. This is enforced by people with power whose goal is unity through coercion. We see this type of government in various totalitarian governments in the past and in many governments around the world today. We also see this type of society ruthlessly applied by the political left. In some cases, they hold the reins of political power. In other cases, they exert their totalitarian influence through the academy, the media, or popular culture. My commentary yesterday was yet one more reminder that even the slightest deviation from leftist standards can put you on the liberal blacklist. Public shaming, lawsuits, and a cancel culture are just a few of the tools used to enforce unity and political purity. As we celebrate the 4th of July this weekend, let's remind ourselves that freedom and diversity is our goal, not a coerced unity and a form of totalitarianism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a little bit longer, focus on this whole idea of the coronavirus and the pandemic, and then we'll move on to some other issues. One of the other articles we have here is social media election interference, and so I want to talk about that. Some of the push right now to not only tear down various monuments, but to close down Mount Rushmore, because after all, you got some slave owners up there on the rock face. I don't know that they want to sandblast it all off, but who would know? And some advice coming from Kevin Bacon. You know, you're only 6 or 7 different ways away from Kevin Bacon on various things. Well, anyway, he's telling a lot of the individuals in Hollywood, just don't talk. I think he's smart, one, because he wants to sound like he's listening, but second of all, recognize that almost anything he said could be misinterpreted. So it's kind of interesting that he's saying we're just in a listening mode. We don't want to say anything because anything we say probably could be misinterpreted. Boy, he's right on that. But let's come back to this issue of state policies. As I mentioned yesterday, there are all sorts of people that want to say that we opened up too soon. And Jim Garrity, who's been kind of following this at National Review more than anybody else, said he spent some time talking to a medical director. And the director really hated at the time to see hospitals canceling elective surgeries. In the state of Texas, since most of you live in the state of Texas right now, listen to this program, they have actually canceled again elective procedures in 8 counties in this country, in this state. And in order to do usual surgery and medicine caseloads, we have to, he says, have some number of intensive bed cares open to be prepared for unexpected problems. But there's a pandemic that's threatening that, and he's really concerned that that might have been a problem. Now, the medical director actually said that he doesn't buy the argument that states reopen too soon. He said, I'm sure we would have fewer patients in the hospital and fewer dying if we had stayed in lockdown another month, but the price was too much to pay. I'm going to talk about that price in just a minute. Even if you don't buy the argument about the harms of keeping people out of work and school, the delay bringing back routine medical care is costing lives. So he's at least in the world of reality, which unfortunately a lot of people that want to have a second lockdown aren't. And so Jim Garrity says, I've come to the conclusion that the George Floyd protests were minor spreads of the coronavirus, not as bad as young people gathering in bars and throwing parties. If you look at the rather significant uptick, I'll use Minneapolis as a good example, among those 20 years of age or older, 20 to 40, you see that just jump dramatically, almost like an exponential growth. Did that happen because of the protests? Probably. You could say some of that maybe in the bars, but the way and the time it happened, maybe that's the case. But in many other places, we are not seeing it. And back to the more relevant point, if you live in New York City, if you live in San Francisco, if you are a contact tracer in Orlando, Florida, I'm just picking out 3 states and cities where this is happening, you are not allowed to ask patients if they participated in any of the protests. So if you think we're ever going to get accurate numbers, you know that it first started in New York City where they told the contact tracers not to ask about protests. Then it's gone to San Francisco and even places like Orlando. And then here, even the Los Angeles Times, the headline here says, health officials have attributed the rising numbers to a combination of factors. Well, what would those be? The reopening of many businesses. To their fair, they put mass protests over the death of George Floyd and then clusters of cases of private gatherings. So the bottom line is we may have some more protests over the weekend, but if anything, I think the 4th of July weekend is going to be a time where if people just decide to cast any kind of concern to the winds, we're going to see horrible spikes this time next week. Because that does seem to me that some people are convinced that it's all over. If there are some fireworks, and I've heard just down the street from where we are, they have, was it Kaboom Town? They're not even going to actually fire the fireworks there. They're going to fire them somewhere else on video, and then you watch the video. Well, I can watch that from New York City. But I just think there are going to be a lot of people going into restaurants, a lot of people getting close to close, a lot of people doing barbecues. And you know what? They probably don't take people's temperature when they come walking in the door, and they have not a clue who they're standing next to when they're watching the fireworks or whatever. So this could go from bad to worse very significantly. And if nothing else, just an illustration, again, that we probably are going to have to pay attention to this in the future. Here's a good example of what I don't want you to do. Students in Tuscaloosa, Alabama have reported having parties and then betting on who catches COVID-19 first. This according to the Tuscaloosa Fire Chief, Randy Smith. And so this is just a typical example of irresponsible college behavior. First of all, this is one of those articles where you get it and you go, okay, I got a lot of questions. First of all, why are Alabama students still at the university? I mean, maybe they just live in town in Tuscaloosa, so that's quite possible. After all, if you come from different parts of Alabama and you were going to go to school, especially if you thought you might be going to summer school, you probably would be in an apartment. So, yeah, you probably didn't really head home to be with your parents. And maybe there were some that were going to be taking summer school classes or just decided to stay in their apartment and even take the classes online. So I guess that's right. But who are these stupid students throwing parties, betting on who gets the coronavirus first? We've always said that college students aren't very bright sometimes, and there's another great example of it. But let's now get to the other part. I mentioned Timothy Carney a minute ago. Let me come back to him because, my goodness, he's putting out some of the best articles here. Isolation is deadly, he says. Stay-at-home orders are causing a spike in overdoses. This shouldn't surprise you if you read some of my commentaries, but the point that he was making is that we're starting to see an additional number of overdose deaths due to the lockdowns, and that's the data that has been collected by the Washington Post. And Again, Timothy Carney says this is horrifying, but it shouldn't be surprising. School closures, business closures, church closures, stay-at-home orders are all efforts to save lives by slowing the spread of the coronavirus. All true. But he says there are trade-offs, including lost lives. Suicides, heart failures, alcohol abuse could all be increasing because of the lockdowns. It's hard to say all of that right now, but the Post has found a correlation in the data. Okay, I'll be the first one to admit, Statistics 101, correlation doesn't mean causation. But does it fit with what we would expect? I think that it does. And again, let's just take a couple of examples. Cook County, Illinois, it's up there in the Chicago area, has seen overdose deaths increase between 50% and 100% from a year ago. The Post, Washington Post, also points to some possible reasons why that same amount of drug abuse would amid lockdowns and the pandemic, lead to overdoses. The first is the disrupted supply lines, leading to people taking more synthetic drugs. A second reason is even darker. Social distancing has also sequestered people, leaving them to take drugs alone, making it less likely that somebody else would be there to call 911 if they had an overdose. Put another way, if people are still taking heroin, they're doing it alone and they're dying from it. Of course, you can talk about methamphetamine, you can talk about OxyContin and all the other things we've talked about here as well. And also just the issue of what? Depression. People are home alone more. The places where they would visit friends, neighbors, been closed. People don't have jobs. Sometimes that gives them regularity, gives them purpose, it gives them earned income. All of that's lost. So if nothing else, it is just a reminder that there is an incredible cost with a lockdown. And one of the reasons why, even though we're going to hear a real drumbeat for the lockdown, I don't think that's a very good idea. Before we take a break, since we're talking about the coronavirus, and I'm going to change topics when we get back after the break, I did not see this one coming, and that is the World Health Organization. I know you're not really respectful of them right now. Basically said that China never reported the existence of the coronavirus. Apparently, the World Health Organization has been trying to do the bidding of China for some time, Communist China. And it says, contrary to claims from both Chinese officials and the World Health Organization, China did not report the existence of the coronavirus in late 2019, according to the World Health Organization timeline tracking the spread of the virus. Rather, international health officials discovered the virus through information posted to a U.S. website. That shouldn't surprise you, but if you wanted one more reason why we shouldn't trust the Chinese, turns out that even the argument and the claim that they actually reported to the World Health Organization turns out to be incorrect. Turns out to be actually a lie, if you want to talk about that. Well, I'm going to talk about some other things that have increased, not just drug abuse and things of that nature, but you know that Summer of Love up there at Chaz, now Chop? Spike in crime in Seattle, 525% increase in crime because of Chop and Chaz, that fictitious country in the midst of the suburb there in Seattle. We'll talk more about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention we've got lots of things on the website today, including a commentary, which I'll mention a little bit later, Two Types of Society. It was really something that I started writing about because of just a short piece by Ben Shapiro, in which he was sort of making the argument for we're kind of in this totalitarian moment in which, on one hand, we've always assumed, especially as we come to Independence Day, day, the 4th of July, that we would like to have the greatest amount of freedom. But in order to have some kind of unity, we're obviously always going to disagree about issues. If you read the Federalist Papers, which I had to when I was in graduate school, you can see that James Madison had no hope that we would ever get rid of what he called factions. There are always going to be people that are going to have differing opinions. But how do you get unity in the midst of that? Well, you find a way in which you have ambition rivaling ambition. You have checks and balances. You make sure that people have the greatest amount of freedom to express their opinions and their views, whether they're religious or political opinions. That's called the First Amendment. They have enough freedom from government, so there's not intrusion, whether it is the Third Amendment, you can't house troops in people's homes, and the Second Amendment giving you the right to bear arms, and the Fourth Amendment to not have an unlawful search and seizure. And ultimately, you just provide some means by which, when there are disagreements, you flesh them out, you debate them. One side sometimes wins, the other side loses. Sometimes there's some compromise, but you try to create unity. And that has been the model that we have used. And it's still the model that's at least in the Constitution and in the constitutions of various governments in the Western world and even various governments in various states. But there's also a totalitarian model that says, nope, we get unity by having everybody believe the same thing. And if anybody steps out of line from what is considered to be assumed valuable kind of information, at that point, then you run into persecution. And that's kind of what has been the model that we've seen in the streets. A good example of that we can find in this particular article, because there was this desire to try to establish, and I didn't take it that seriously, so we did have some fun with it, this so-called autonomous zone, which was first called Chaz, then later was called CHOP. But it doesn't really matter whether you call it the autonomous zone or the occupied protest, CH stand for Capitol Hill. In some respects, we knew that it was not going to work. And the reason for it is that it was based upon kind of a totalitarian model. Anybody that came into that section would be persecuted if they disagreed at all. And the disagreements surfaced time and time again. It allowed for individuals in the midst of that sort of anarchy to have guns, knives, whatever, to intimidate people around them. And so as a result, what was at one point called the Summer of Love by the Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan ultimately became as awful as some of the things that unfolded during the 1960s Summer of Love. But let's, if we can, look at some of the news articles. One of those is the Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan's emergency order was able to, as it says, boot protesters from the 6-block cop-free zone. And it makes mention of the reason for that was narcotics use, violent crime, rape, robbery, assault, and increased gang activity. You think? And so from June 2nd to June 30th, according to the statistics which are held by the Seattle Police Department, they saw an increase in crime of 525% compared to the same period last year. And again, this order illustrates it only so well. The Seattle mayor's emergency order talks about 22 additional incidents of in-person related crime in the area, also 2 additional homicides, 6 additional robberies, 16 additional aggravated assaults, to include 2 additional non-fatal shootings. And, of course, that's just what's reported. You know as well as I do, there were not police officers there. And there may be, even after the fact, individuals that have lived in that community, either in the homes or the businesses, that didn't dare report it to the police for fear that there would be repercussions. So that's just what we know from the order issued by the Seattle mayor, who not so long ago was referring to this as kind of the Summer of Love. There have been all sorts of Twitter response, but I thought this one was the best. let's see, 6 shootings, 2 teenage deaths, and then the mayor of Seattle still says it's an arts festival. Then Chaz threatens to take over her 5,000 square foot house worth $7.6 million after a new addition. A day later, she brings in the police to end the chaos. I thought that was a good line. It just illustrates what you are talking about in terms of this totalitarian temptation. And of course, so as we have pointed out, we're not just now talking about taking over various pieces of a city. We're not just talking about tearing down some of these various kinds of statues. The latest one has been, let's close down Mount Rushmore. I suspect somewhere along the line we're probably going to get somebody that wants to actually deface it, but that would be quite an undertaking, because the only way you'd really significantly deface it is to blow it up with some kind of dynamite. But nevertheless, the New York Times, always on the cutting edge of the mob's ideas, actually went out of its way to suggest that maybe the best way, at least one of the columnists, would be the best way to just simply close it down. And so this response comes from one of the articles that was written. The New York Times has faced intense backlash over its report about the history of Mount Rushmore ahead of President Trump's scheduled 4th of July celebration at the National Monument. Mr. President, I know you're not listening, but if somebody knows him, tell him not to do this. But anyway, how Mount Rushmore became Mount Rushmore. They tell the story. By the way, I think we've talked about this on the program here before, because it was put together by the sculptor Gutzon Borglum, who has had at least some relationship to the KKK. I don't think it was that direct, but they were making a big deal out of it. And then so you've got, first of all, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Well, those were slave owners. Theodore Roosevelt, well, we just took him down the other day right outside of the museum. And, of course, Abraham Lincoln, but they're tearing down his statue as well. So here you have a situation in which the Times was saying what you have here is something that was built on land that belonged to the Lakota tribe and sculpted by a man who had strong bonds with the KKK. I think I would disagree partially with that, but he had some bonds. That's all. Strong, of course, all right. And then has the features of 2 U.S. presidents who were slave owners. So that's the argument is that if nothing else, Twitter users were then referring to the New York Times as the woke police or the woke mob. But I do love Buck Sexton. Gosh, it's been a long time since we've ever had Buck on, and he has so much radio, I don't really know what could eat him anymore. But Buck Sexton, who's an individual that has worked, didn't he work for the Secret Service? I'm pretty sure he did. Or the CIA. I kind of forget all that right now, but he does a lot of talk shows and really very well done. But anyway, he said, here's what I suggest to the New York Times, because the New York Times said it's time to close down Mount Rushmore because, after all, it was land that belonged to the Indians. It's sculpted by a man with some bad relationships, and it has the face of 2 presidents that were slaveholders. And he said, I have a solution for the New York Times. The New York Times building is located on land the Dutch colonists swindled from the native population, and then they must abandon their stolen land and donate the proceeds to Black Lives Matter movement. So that was just an attempt to have a little bit of fun at recognizing that where your building is located could be used as a justification for that as well. Were slaves ever held in that particular part of Manhattan Island? Probably. Were some of the people that built that building that the New York Times was in? Probably, if we could go back and check some people who had unsavory characteristics. So, as I've said before, when you start throwing lots of rocks, just make sure you're not in a glass house, because it could come back on you. But just before we take a break, and then I'll talk about how social media election interference might be important in this next election. But more recently, Kevin Bacon has actually told various individuals in Hollywood to zip it. He uses some other phrases that my mother never let me say around the house, so I won't say them either. But the point he's making is, really, if you look at this, he says it's incredible to experience this and go through this historically, not just the COVID-19, but clearly seeing the protests and what's going on. He says, for an old guy like me, I was born in 1958, and to witness the passion of these young people across the world for social justice, it leaves me speechless, which is probably a good idea, because I think it's a good time for old white guys like me to just, and he goes, blankety blank and shut up and listen. And so the point he's making is that what he is suggesting is that he, and along with other individuals, matter of fact, one of those, Simon Pegg, who, from Star Trek and everything else, he used some other words, but all of them are basically, stay quiet, don't say anything, it's just going to get you in trouble. So we may not hear a lot more from some people in Hollywood. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention real quickly that one of our other articles we've posted here is entitled Social Media's Election Interference. And the first thing that we always try to remind you is when we talk about social media, we're talking about the so-called big tech organizations. And these are big tech organizations which, by and large, are private companies. So on the one hand, they have the right to do editorial evaluation of what they post on their site. But the actual section, it's Section 230, which is part of the Communications Decency Act, protects them as if they were a public forum. Now, the difference between a public forum and one where you have editorial content would be an example. For example, right now, if you go to a public park and they have a place where somebody gets out with a bullhorn and expresses his or her opinion, you couldn't then go and sue the park for something you heard them say that you disagreed with. However, if that same individual went on to a page, let's say the page for the Washington Post or a page like a Facebook that wasn't protected by this and said some very outrageous things, maybe defamatory things, maybe slanderous or libel things, you could not only sue them, but you could sue the individuals that provided the forum for that. But the argument is that Facebook is like a public forum. We don't monitor what people say. But, of course, that's exactly what they've been doing. And the bigger issue is, if you say, well, then we need to resolve that issue, there is absolutely no interest in Congress right now to do this. The Democrats are thrilled that it's doing this to the president and to other political candidates, and the Republicans don't see this as a fight at all. It is not a hill worth dying for right now, and so maybe there will be a fight in the future over Section 230, which gives a tremendous amount of protection to Facebook, Twitter, and all the other groups. But that's not happening. And there is a second issue to this, even more relevant to the election. We can maybe resolve some of this after we get out of this politicized 2020 presidential and congressional election. But the real issue, as Julie Kelly points out in this article, and you have to go by the first three paragraphs to find out that the problem with social media is that teens and young adults don't read newspapers or watch network news, according to the most recent poll we have. More than 1/3 of them, ages 18 to 39, list social media as their primary source of news. I would add, for many of them, their only source of news. So if Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you can get some of the others, but those are probably the three that I'll mention at the moment, or maybe even YouTube videos and things like that, are the way in which you get your news, then those few big tech companies, and they're pretty consolidated even at that, basically rule the news cycle for the younger vote. And so the information, as she points out, is rarely posted without a comment, and so consumers are told not only how to interpret the article, but why that article is important. And then, of course, as we have pointed out on this program many times before, just find my booklet on social media. Half of the booklet is on social media censorship, some that has happened in the past and others that came from a Senate hearing that went through a very long list, and I give you like 3 examples of that. So once you recognize that social media moguls, as Julie Kelly calls them, once you understand the obvious, and that is they're hostile to Donald Trump and are part of the kind of ruling corporate left, as she calls it, they're actually using all of the unrest right now as an excuse to censor the president. And as she says, they're not really even trying to hide it. A little bit later, she talks about how, again, Zuckerberg, that'd be Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, disclosed that he's been advised by civil rights auditors, that sounds like she says language from Ayn Rand novels, to develop portals that will offer authoritative information on voting rights. But if you go into those portals, you recognize that they will not allow any conversation that is critical, for example, of mail-in ballots. So any of my commentaries on mail-in ballots would never be allowed in there, although at the moment I think they've still allowed my commentaries at Facebook, but just barely. And, of course, a variety of other issues which are just simply seen as not even appropriate. So you can see the difficulty there. Then let's move from Facebook to Twitter, because she talks about that. Twitter has now been suppressing the president's tweets by attaching warning notices that the company has posted in anytime they seem to be in violating the fact check policy. Now, I'll be the first to admit, this president sometimes says some things. I wish he was more precise, but precision is not his strength for sure. And he does engage in a great deal of hyperbole, but some of the fact-checking on the president, as I even pointed out yesterday, is just simply unfair. When he says that all of the major cities are run by Democrats, and then you have fact-checkers saying, well, no, it's only 17 of the 20, and then 2 others are actually like San Antonio and Las Vegas, which are technically nonpartisan elections, but they're both in Democratic strongholds. You can figure that one out pretty quickly. So that gets up to 19 out of 20. And the only outlier is Jacksonville, Florida, which does have a Republican mayor. Okay, if we're going to get that kind of fact checking, even if he tried to be precise, wouldn't work because they would still find him in violation of their fact checking policy. And so the point is she says, is the social media's brazen actions are election interference, pure and simple. It's no less insidious. In fact, it's more insidious than meddling by a foreign adversary. We're thinking about Russia there, of course. Their activity is political, not commercial, removing ads, banning accounts, flagging tweets, regurgitating the Democratic Party line and need for absentee voting should be considered in-kind contributions to the candidacy of Joe Biden and the Democrats. But according to federal election law, social media companies will not actually do that, but they should be required to report these contributions and place a monetary value on them. So the point I'm making is pretty simple. That is, this is the reality. And for the president to win re-election, it is an incredible uphill slog, because I am convinced that the Democrats will not ignore states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania like they did under a Hillary Clinton campaign. And when you only win by 10,000 votes in Wisconsin, only 27,000 votes in Michigan, you can turn that around pretty quickly. And if you look at a lot of the polls and all of the strife and the pandemic and the protests and the riots and all sorts of other things, and maybe just even election fatigue, and you add it to the fact that most of the major media are against you and all of social media seems to be against you, it would be tough for the president to win re-election. But things sometimes like that actually do happen. They happened a little less than 4 years ago, so we'll see. But it's just a sad commentary. And I think Julie Kelly does a good job of talking about how social media is putting their finger on the scales in terms of this election. So that's just the reality that not only Donald Trump, but many other office holders that are incumbents, maybe Republicans and others, are going to have to face in terms of what is going to be, I think, social media bias. So if you'd like to read some of these articles, we have posted them on the website. The one on it's not a second wave rather than just a different wave, one on the social media election interference. When we come back, we're going to talk with Tony Suarez, because the Supreme Court ruled on DACA. And we're going to talk about what that means, how to think about this from a Christian point of view. And again, as the Chief Operating Officer for the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, I want you to know more about him. Maybe you might even invite him to come and speak in your church about the outreach that you would like to have to the Hispanic community. And most importantly, I think you would really benefit from just the incredibly dynamic speaker that he is. So that's coming up next. And don't forget, in the second hour after that, Mitch Glaser, Messiah in the Passover. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Thursday edition of Point of View. I am so glad that you can join us today. And over the next couple hours, going to cover a number of different topics. We have scheduled Tony Suarez to be with us. He serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. Haven't connected up with him yet, but hopefully we'll be able to do so. We're going to talk about this idea of DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that was instituted many years ago, about 8 years ago in round numbers, by President Barack Obama, and then was challenged before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled that at the time, the government, that is the administration, had not done everything to actually correct the manner in which they were closing it down. It was created, I think, unconstitutionally, and then it's almost like the court said, well, but you can't close it down once it gets started. And it's like, well, no, it wasn't created in the right way in the first place. But we will see if we can talk with him about that. Let me also kind of give you an overview, because we have some articles today on how social media election interference might be very significant, not just in the presidential election, but we saw it showing up sometimes in Senate elections. No second wave, just different wave. And I thought I'd spend some time on that before we connect up with Tony Suarez, because we did set a record yesterday, the largest single day increase in the number of coronavirus cases. And so this is a concern. The record-breaking increase in new cases continues to push the United States further beyond what some previously thought was a peak. If you happen to be watching online, I'll hold up a graph that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea that shows you that things were actually going up and then kind of leveling off, and then look like it might drop and then has gone back up again. Now, again, there are some reasons for it. And the first thing that I'm sure some of you are going to say is, well, we've been doing more testing. Well, that's part of it. That's not necessarily all of it, but that is part of it. We do recognize that a little of that, and there's some pretty good evidence to suggest that some of that came from the protest, but most of it has to do with people getting back to normal without any kind of distancing, without face masks, and especially in some of these places where people are in close proximity, in bars, in restaurants. Even when you go over to another family and you have a 4th of July cookout this weekend, or you go and watch fireworks and you're shoulder to shoulder with all sorts of individuals for long periods of time, you can see that as the problem. And so we're starting to see some of these states which actually are facing some pretty significant increases. I'm thinking of those of you, for example, in Arizona, Florida, Texas, a couple of other places like that as well. And so there is an attempt to try to close some of this down. Our listeners up there in Michigan know there was another order signed yesterday by the governor, Richard Whitmer, attempting to close down some of the indoor businesses and restaurants and things like that. Let's go to California, wanting to close down restaurants and wineries and tasting rooms. And, of course, all over the country, movie theaters, and even in New York City, which has been a place that had a hot spot, now much less. Still signed order yesterday by the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, that the city will not allow restaurants to reopen their indoor dining sections and facilities for July 6th, which is next Monday. So part of the concern is the fact that as we go into the 4th of July weekend, some of you are probably going to say, well, we've been locked down enough We need to go to a cookout. We need to go to a restaurant. We need to go to some fireworks. We need to do all sorts of things that we can. And that's pretty irresponsible. But my best example of irresponsibility comes from our friends in Alabama. I've spoken at the University of Alabama. I've been to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And this one is a head shaker for sure. Students in Tuscaloosa, Alabama have reportedly been hosting parties and betting on who catches COVID-19 first. This according to the Tuscaloosa Fire Chief Randy Smith. Okay, we know college kids do stupid things. This is on the level of really stupid, idiotic, and yet you might look at them and say, how much different are some of these supposedly mature adults that are getting together, going to bars, getting face-to-face with individuals and passing this on one to another? Again, one of the posting here, Tuscaloosa Fire Chief Randy Smith says that they discovered students who knew they were, this is right, are you ready for this? Knew they were COVID-19 positive, have been attending parties, and this information was given to the council there. So first of all, they want to see who else gets it when they go to parties when they are infectious. This is just irresponsible, and I just picked one example. I love our friends in Alabama. I go to Alabama all the time, flying into Birmingham, been Tuscaloosa, but this is nuts. By the way, there are a couple of questions that come to your mind. First of all, why are students in Tuscaloosa? Well, I think we know why. You know, if they come from various parts of the South, whether it's Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, wherever, and they have an apartment, they're probably just going to stay in the apartment, and maybe we're even taking their classes online from their apartment, so they're already there. Some of them maybe just decided never to go home. Others maybe were going to take summer courses, but whatever. Why are they there? And second of all, why in the world are they acting so stupid? But I would suggest that as we head into this 4th of July weekend, if you act like that, we're going to be next week reporting even more record cases for the coronavirus. That being said, just before we take a break, I thought I'd pick out this one from David Harsanyi, who talks about the left's coronavirus narrative is a myth. And that is, he points out that to this point, 71% more Americans have died in New York nursing homes than have died in the entire state of Florida, which not only has a larger population, but a population that skews older. To this point, New York's death rate is 10 times larger than Florida's. And he does that simply to remind you that when you start hearing these media narratives wanting to say that any Republican governor who's a friend of Donald Trump, we need to throw them out of office because they've been so irresponsible, all you have to do is go back and look at the deaths per million. Deaths per million in New Jersey, 1,700. Deaths per million in New York, 1,600. Deaths per million in Connecticut, 1,200. Let's go back to Florida, 163. Texas, 86. For my friends out there in Georgia, I guess it's 264. But none of them are even close to what we've had in New England, which gets us to the second article we've posted here. It's not so much a second wave. It is that the wave hit so hard first in New England. Now it's showing up a little bit here in the South. But when you have the death rate per million in New Jersey, 1,700, and the death rate per million in Georgia, 264, there's a real difference. Like a third of that. By the time you get to the state of Texas, we've heard about how Governor Greg Abbott is so irresponsible. 86 compared to 1,700. You can begin to see it's very different. And then when they also try to compare it to other countries, deaths per million, Belgium 854, UK 657, Sweden 523, United States 397. Again, I know numbers are sometimes hard to follow on air, but it's just a good apt illustration of the fact that we have a very big country. Yes, we have different kinds of waves of outbreak, but if you do just a comparison of the deaths in America compared to the deaths, for example, in the UK, well, they look good until you do it per million. You realize we're still doing pretty well here. But it might go the other direction, so pay attention and use common sense this weekend. We have more to say right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we approach the traditional time in America for which we celebrate its independence, it's worth considering two types of political society that we find in the world. The first is what we celebrate. We begin with the idea that government is instituted by human beings to provide liberty and security. We need enough government to ensure that we are safe, but we don't want so much government that we lose our freedom. Ben Shapiro talks about this in his editorial on our totalitarian moment. He explains that in this form of government, we agree not to infringe on another's life, liberty, and property, and we create a government capable of preventing or prosecuting such infringements. We may disagree with one another on key issues, but we allow the system of government to provide a means of resolving disputes. The second view requires purification. The goal is homogeneity instead of diversity. This is enforced by people with power whose goal is unity through coercion. We see this type of government in various totalitarian governments in the past and in many governments around the world today. We also see this type of society ruthlessly applied by the political left. In some cases, they hold the reins of political power. In other cases, they exert their totalitarian influence through the academy, the media, or popular culture. My commentary yesterday was yet one more reminder that even the slightest deviation from leftist standards can put you on the liberal blacklist. Public shaming, lawsuits, and a cancel culture are just a few of the tools used to enforce unity and political purity. As we celebrate the 4th of July this weekend, let's remind ourselves that freedom and diversity is our goal, not a coerced unity and a form of totalitarianism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, we haven't connected up with Tony Suarez, but I certainly have a lot more to say about the pandemic. And the first thing I just said a minute ago is enjoy this 4th of July weekend coming up. I know some of you have been in lockdown for a long time, and you're probably just saying, I just need to get out. I need some fresh air. I need to walk around. I need to see some people. I want to watch some fireworks. Okay, but be really careful because these numbers have gone up pretty significantly. And if you say, well, I got to see it for myself, I understand. You know, you've always heard the old phrase that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I wish it were, because some of my photography that hangs on my wall in my office at home, certainly there's a lot of stories I can tell about each one of those pictures. But I would also suggest you a graph tells you 1,000 words. And the article that I mentioned just a minute ago by Tim Carney, I'm going to quote from him a little bit. I don't know him, but I'm starting to be very impressed with the work he's done on the pandemic. He has multiple charts. And so first of all, it shows national hospitalization numbers. Then he breaks it down into different areas. For our friends that are in the Northeast, he has one for New York and New Jersey. For our friends in Michigan, he has kind of just one in Detroit in particular, but you can kind of get an implication there what's happened in Michigan. He's got one, of course, also for New England. For our listeners in Florida, we have one there. For our friends out there in California and Nevada, he's got another one. So anyway, the bottom line is that he breaks it down and then puts them all together. And the point he's making is that really it can sometimes seem, as he says, that we're experiencing a second wave of the coronavirus. But if you really go back and look at it, you had some parts of the country, let's take New York City, and I'll pick Detroit as well, in which they had very significant outbreaks in March. And so now those are tapering off, and you can see that on the graph. Then we have others that, because of the lockdown, avoided the virus for a time. That's Florida, Arizona, Texas, and they're now experiencing it. So I don't think it's so much a second wave as a differently timed wave. But again, one of the reasons I posted this article that comes from the Washington Examiner is I think the graph really helps you see that, and also gives you some talking points, because you may be in a state right now that's saying, we're getting a second wave, we were afraid of this is exactly why we need to close the country down again. No, that is not why we need to close down the country. And as a matter of fact, a minute ago I was even going to read from, I might as well since we haven't gotten Tony here, one of the comments being made by a medical director who says that, again, there are now a number of hospitals really canceling elective procedures. Today I'm broadcasting from the state of Texas, and there are 8 counties in the state of Texas which no longer allow elective surgeries. The medical director that was being interviewed here said, I'm sure we would have fewer patients in the hospital and fewer dying if we had stayed in lockdown another month. But he said the price was too much to pay. Even if you don't buy the argument about harms of people out of work and school, the delay bringing back routine medical care is costing lives. So he was simply looking at the issue of individuals who weren't getting tested. They weren't getting surgeries that would actually improve a person's health and maybe even improve the longevity of their life, because those were seen as elective procedures. Well, let me come back to Timothy Carney. This is a different article that maybe I'll do a commentary on. Isolation is deadly. You think? Stay-at-home orders are causing a spike in overdoses. Now, this one's only pretty much just looking at drug overdoses, but again, he points out that if you look at the data, and he's pulling this from the Washington Post, and coming to the conclusion that school closures, business closures, church closures, and stay-at-home orders are all efforts to save lives by slowing the spread of the coronavirus. So far, so good. But he then points out there are trade-offs, including lost lives. Suicides, heart failure, alcohol abuse could all be increasing because of the lockdowns. He says it's hard to say right now because the Washington Post has found a correlation. But again, statistics 101, a correlation isn't always a causation, but I think in this case we could probably conclude that it is. Let's talk to our listeners up there in Illinois for just a minute. Let me take Cook County, good example. The number of overdose deaths increased between 50 and 100% from a year ago. So you have twice as much deaths from drug overdoses in Chicago area, Cook County, than you did a year ago at this time. Now, the article in the Washington Post points to some reasons. One that is disturbing, one that is really disturbing. The first argument is there could be a disruption in the supply chains of drugs. Never even thought about that, which would then lead people to take more deadly synthetic drugs because in some respects, COVID-19 has not only affected the supply chains of things which are legal, but also affected the supply chains of things that are illegal. By the way, if I could, I hardly ever make a personal note, but we lost our refrigerator last week. And boy, is it hard to find a refrigerator. Because after all, just as we went to lockdown, people still buying refrigerators. Matter of fact, even thinking they might want to get an upgrade in the refrigerator if they're going to be locked down. They want to make sure the refrigerator works. So a lot of people were buying refrigerators. And then when you lock down the factories, we weren't producing any more refrigerators. And it took a lot just to go get a new refrigerator. And the old refrigerator just got drug out about a day or two ago. So supply chains affect everything, not only legal things, but in this case, illegal ones. The second reason, even more disturbing, never thought about this. This is a direct quote from the Washington Post. Social distancing has also sequestered people, leaving them to take drugs alone and making it less likely that someone else will be there to call 911. Not even thought about that. Put another way, people are, he says, still taking heroin, but they're doing it alone. And they're maybe taking methamphetamine, and maybe taking OxyContin, whatever. And so we are seeing that drug abuse and drug use is increasing during the lockdowns. And of course, there's some other reasons for that as well, because people are just feeling tense. People are feeling empty. When you're at home alone, you're not visiting friends, meeting neighbors. When you're not going to the jobs provide you regularity, a structure, a purpose, not to mention earned income and things like that. Of course, we don't have sports. We don't have local concerts. We don't have public events. And so as a result, we're coming to the rather obvious conclusion that isolation is deadly. And if you had any doubts about that, my most recent commentary has been on the whole issue of loneliness. One of my most recent booklets that we've made available is kind of loneliness in a lockdown. And that is, again, just one more of those social costs of the shelter in place and lockdowns. But just before we take a break, I thought I would point out that not only are we seeing the number of drug overdoses increasing, but in Seattle, we're seeing an incredible spike in crime in Seattle. And that has to do with the country known as Chaz or TOP. Capitol Hill Occupied Protest was kind of the latest name for it. And the Seattle mayor, Jenny Durkan, finally ordered the police to move in. You might remember she sort of referred to this area as the Summer of Love. Here's one of these articles. The mayor, Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan's emergency order booted, it says, protesters from the 6-block cop-free zone, making mention of the, quote, now's a direct quote, narcotics use, violent crime, including rape, robbery, assault, and increased gang activity within that so-called sovereign nation in the suburbs there in Seattle. Between June 2nd and June 30th, an increase in crime by 525%, a 5-fold increase in crime compared to the same period last year. In the executive order, if I might quote from the Seattle mayor, who before called this a summer of love, and had all sorts of other great lines. What was one of the other lines she had? Because she had this as like it was an arts festival. That was the line. This is from her actual executive order. Quote, 22 additional incidents, in-person related crime in the area, to include 2 additional homicides, 6 additional robberies, and 16 additional aggravated assaults, to include 2 additional non-fatal shootings. Just a little bit of a quote from what was called the Summer of Love, or the Seattle Arts Festival, which relates to my commentary, which is posted today, on kind of the totalitarian temptation and 2 different types of society. So we'll talk about that after the break and get into my Viewpoints commentary today. And since we haven't met up with Tony Suarez, we'll maybe move on to my other article, and that is the influence, I believe, of the social media on the election. Very good piece by Julie Kelly. And if you find yourself saying, wait a minute, I want to read some of this, for myself, or I'd like to post this on my Facebook page, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. And when we come back from the break, I might just get Warren Kelly in here for a minute. Some people have been asking about the matching fund. We're making progress on it, and just thought we'd see where we are before we enter into the 4th of July weekend. So we'll chat with him and get into some of these issues in the news right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me mention in just a minute, we're going to get to my piece on social media's election interference. And if you haven't received my little booklet on social media, we'd just like to make that available because about half of it talks about the influence of social media. The other half deals with social media censorship. Probably going to have to just create a whole book just on social media censorship and those kinds of things. We were talking about this issue of loneliness. That is a booklet there as well. So those are just some of the benefits that you get sometimes if you join at a certain level with the Truth Team. And I just thought before we enter into the 4th of July weekend, I've had some people asking some questions. Okay, did you make some of the match? Did you make all the match? Why does this particular banner still say $100,000 matching fund? And I could try to explain it, but I brought in the president of Point of View, Warren Kelly. And Warren, maybe you can kind of explain a little bit of the history, because this time last week, wasn't that when we had Foster Freeze on?
Yes, it
and
was.
Here we are a week later with a lot of good news, but still a few steps that we need to climb to finish that mountain.
So without a doubt, this is the most confusing match and fiscal year-end campaign that we have ever had in our existence. But we didn't have a match, as you said, until Foster was on a week ago. So just at the very last minute, Foster came on and he offered while he was on the air to match anyone's gift for the campaign up to $50,000 and gave us to the end of the month. And then within a few minutes came back and said, well, you can have until July 15th. But then the very next day, we had another of our wonderful donors who decided to basically match what he was doing and add another $50,000. So we do have a $100,000 match. The first 50 has been matched. We've had a total of about 65,000 that has come in, but that means we're about $35,000 short of reaching Foster's match, which needs to be done by the 15th. So if you haven't given yet, we would really appreciate your help in meeting this, because this is definitely one of those situations that we are going to only receive the amount that we can match.
Yes. And I might just point out that we were trying to get it all done just so we wouldn't even be talking about money today, because, it's July 2nd, and we're getting in the 4th of July weekend, and then we won't even have a chance to probably talk about it much tomorrow, because we decided maybe we should run a tape as well. But, and again, you have some money that's probably coming in, because there are some of us that write checks, so maybe it'll be a little bit less, but that's kind of what it is right now, and $65,000 to probably increase a little bit more once we count the mail today, or whenever we count it again.
We've processed the mail for today, so it's just the mail on next one will be on Monday, so we'll have some gifts that I'm sure will show up on Monday that have been put in the mail that are on their way still, but we are still going to need some help before the 15th. So if you're in a position to help us out, please take a moment right now. You can go to pointofview.net and click on the banner there, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. Or, of course, as Kerby said, some of you just like to put a check in the mail, and that's P.O. Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221.
Well, Warren, thank you for clarifying that. And maybe we can just announce on Monday if some people right now decide to put something in the mail or to contact, that will be done.
That would be wonderful.
But we would like to talk all the time about what's in the news, not about any kind of financial resources. And I certainly want to thank those who did make that deadline of June 30th, because then that's our fiscal year, and that will look good in terms of the audits and other things. So that's just helpful. But either way, some of you were wondering, well, where are we right now? Okay, 65,000 and counting. And if you can help us out and you've been waiting or you didn't hear us talk about it and you'd like to have your dollar for dollar match, it's still on the table. So thank you. Well, let's see if we can get into a couple of other issues. Social media's election interference. And this one is by Julie Kelly. And I thought it was very good because she first talks about, in a couple of paragraphs here, parents and kids interacting and disagreeing. And, well, that's nothing new. But then she points out that the social media phenomenon has really maybe had a more significant effect on the elections than we might have imagined. Leave it to Donald Trump, at that time, candidate Donald Trump 4 years ago, even 5 years ago, to say Twitter might be the way to communicate directly to individuals. And on the other hand, then you had social media, in many cases, challenging him. And, of course, the challenges have become even greater. But here's the issue. Julie Kelly points out that the issue of social media may be more important in this election than it has ever been before because, let me quote from her, teens and young adults don't read newspapers or watch network news. According to a 2018 poll, more than one-third of adults ages 18 to 39 list social media as their primary source of news. Now, I would even go on to say, and I know she only called it the primary source of news, but for many of them, it may be their sole source of news. And so she uses some examples of Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and others that actually, she says, rule the news cycle. And so we have really always acknowledged that much of the mainstream media has been hostile to President Donald Trump, but now the social media moguls are hostile to Donald Trump, and spend some time pointing out, first of all, that Mark Zuckerberg has now put together portals for civil rights auditors to evaluate the various information about voting, about elections, about voting rights, about mail-in ballots and the rest. And Twitter has a fact-checking policy where in many cases they are removing or putting warning notices next to some of the tweets by the president. And so in some respects, the president has really got quite an uphill battle here at the moment in terms of the fact that, first of all, I am absolutely convinced that the Democratic Party is not going to ignore Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania like they did sort of under the Hillary Clinton campaign. Number two, I think you can already assume that he is going to have a very contentious campaign with Joe Biden or whoever they decide to replace him with if they do. And, of course, he's also going to have to fight the social media. So it's going to be an interesting set of circumstances. But one of the things we had planned for this hour was a conversation with Tony Suarez, and he's now joined us by phone. He is a speaker, author, and most importantly serves as the Chief Operating Officer for the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. It's the country's largest Hispanic Christian organization, serves more than 40,000 different congregations. Just a very gifted speaker, and I wanted you to be able to find his website and some of the other material. His book, The Triumphant Church, is great, and you might want to have him come and speak at a conference for you or speak at your church or something else. But I thought it would be good for him to give us some perspective on the Supreme Court decision on DACA. Again, DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. It was implemented about 8 years ago by President Barack Obama in order to provide some relief for about 700,000 what are oftentimes referred to as dreamers. The Supreme Court so far has ruled that the President Donald Trump, cannot remove what President Barack Obama implemented because the argument was they hadn't ended it in a correct manner, but it still leaves open the possibility that that might take place. So I thought, just to get some perspective from a Christian point of view, Tony Suarez joins us now. And Tony, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for that introduction, and I think I owe you a commission if anybody calls.
Well, first of all, we have a link to your Facebook page, your Twitter page, and your web page. So if people want to learn more, first of all, let's, if we can, talk about that. A lot of people say, well, why do we have the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals? There's what's called DACA and DAPA. I won't confuse people right now, but you have, in round numbers, about 700,000 individuals who were born in this country. They didn't immigrate here. They were born here. And so they have, I would assume, all the necessary paperwork. But if their parents were deported back, you would say, well, what is the status for these individuals? But tell us a little bit more, because you've been following this even more so than anybody else.
Absolutely. Well, and again, thank you for having me, and thank you for talking about this subject. One of the issue with everything, every time we're going to come down to the bottom line, why is the system broken? Every time it's going to point the onus back to Congress and the failure of the House and the Senate to make any decision on any sort of immigration reform for over 30 years. So let that sink in, that Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States the last time our House and Senate were successful at passing any type of immigration reform.
Wow.
Since that time, what we've had are patchwork executive orders by President George Herbert Walker Bush and Clinton and George W. and Obama, because the House and the Senate can't get their act together and come to an agreement. And it always boils down to politics. It always boils down to the Speaker of the House, whether it be Boehner or Paul Ryan or Nancy Pelosi, not wanting to make a decision that would give the president or whoever's occupying the office at the time a win.
Yes, well,
And
let's take a break, and then I'm going to come back and talk about that, and we'll see if we can cover all of that in the few minutes we have before the top of the hour. Tony Suarez with us as we talk about the Supreme Court decision on DACA. We'll continue talking about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'm thrilled that we were able to get Tony Suarez on in this hour, and we'll see what we can to try to cover some of those issues. I already talked about some of the problems in Congress. You know, you have 35 U.S. Senate races right now, 435 races for the House of Representatives, so pay attention to that. Maybe you should ask those individuals asking you to re-elect them or to elect them for the first time where they stand on some of these issues. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more about Tony Suarez, we have TonySuarez.com on the website. You don't even have to know how to spell his name, although it's pretty standard. And we also have information there about his book, The Triumphant Church, a forward by, of course, Reverend Samuel Rodriguez. Samuel Rodriguez has been on the program with us so many times before. And so, Tony, we've put enough blame on Congress, but how do we address this issue? Because from a Christian point of view, I know you've been thinking about this for some time.
Absolutely. So, yes, the blame falls at the feet of Congress. We have to hold them accountable. Every member of the House and the Senate are our surrogates. They're there to be the voice of we the people. We elected them to support what our heart's convictions are as Christians and as United States citizens. So where we're at now, the Supreme Court ruling is interesting because it is the president's ability, any president's ability, to pass an executive order and also undo an executive order. So this brings up an argument. Why was it okay? And again, I support DACA. DACA was a deferred program for children that were brought to the country at no fault of their own. Their parents immigrated into the United States, and some of these kids were 2 and 3 years old. It wasn't their decision to cross a border illegally, and they were here. We celebrated, we appreciated the program in 2008. But the first word of DACA is deferred, which meant it was a temporary program. We knew that there had to be a permanent solution. So what's interesting here is that it was okay for President Obama to pass an executive order and bring in a temporary program. But what the Supreme Court is saying is that it's not okay for President Trump to bring an end to that program. Now, knowing the President of the United States through my work with Reverend Rodriguez and the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference and that informal evangelical advisory board to the President, is that he does not want to hurt 700,000 children. He doesn't want to deport 700,000 children. What he does want there to happen is for the Congress and the Senate to pass a permanent solution. We have to stop living on Band-Aids, and we need a permanent fix to the program. And I think that's where we're still at. And I don't believe the Speaker of the House will do anything permanent in the middle of a campaign while we're trying to elect or hopefully keep the President of the United States in for a second term. So that means that this issue is being pushed off until 2021. And it's sad. It's sad because people's lives and families are left in limbo because of perpetual elections. Because in 2021, the argument will be, well, we have midterms coming up and we don't want to do anything before the midterm. And so this is a nonstop cycle that has happened for over 30 years. And at some point, us as Christians and as Americans have to say enough is enough. You can't keep punting the ball down to the next goal. We have to make a decision.
And it would seem to me that right now the president could do something to remove it, but not to fix it. And so really we are asking Congress to do the right thing. And maybe the answer is, Tony, again, I know you're not the political guy that we sometimes have around a round table, but whenever I see the word comprehensive, it's a disaster. Comprehensive health care reform. You know, how's Obamacare working for you? And sometimes people want comprehensive immigration reform. You could very quickly say we could deal with the issue of the Dreamers or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals or DACA program with almost a single sentence or a few sentence bill. So why couldn't we just solve that problem first, then deal with each problem sequentially? Because when you try to put it all bundled together, that seems to be another part of the problem, isn't it?
Yay and amen to everything you said. And what they refer to that in D.C., they refer to it as a piecemeal approach. Let's take this piece by piece, because you're right. Comprehensive immigration reform right now feels like nothing more than just a dream that's not going to happen. But there are two things we can do. We can secure the border, because you can't fix a problem if millions of people, and I'm not saying there's millions, I'm just using that number, but hundreds of thousands or millions of people, if you continue to receive millions of people into the country, you can never fix what's broken. So secure the border, know who's coming in. That has to do with national security. And then deal with this issue of the Dreamers. You can do both of those things. And with those two things being done, then we can move on to the 14 million that are approximately that are in the country and figure out how we solve that. But it's time that happen. It's time. And I think the president has been more than willing to solve this. The issue, again, and I am a broken record on this, the issue is not Pennsylvania Avenue. It's the United States Capitol, where politics are being played right now, and things are. And really, I don't know that they'll move on it until it costs them an election, until someone is voted out because of the incompetency when it comes to this issue. And I know that probably sounds hard coming from a preacher, so forgive me if that sounds judgmental. But until think of, it's the same players. Going back 20 and 30 years, it's the same people in office. If I didn't do my job for 30 days, I wouldn't be working with Reverend Rodriguez anymore.
Yes.
But they've gone 30 years without doing their job, and somehow they keep getting reelected. And I think it's time that we, the people, stand up and say, we didn't elect you for you to further your agenda. We elected you to be a surrogate for we the people, and if you don't do that, then we need to send a different representative that will represent the values of the districts that have sent them to D.C.
Very good. Tony Suarez has been with us, and I want to get you back on again. We can have even more time with you, but if people would like to contact you, one of the things that we certainly appreciate is the material that is available at your website. I hope some people will consider having you come and speak and address not only these issues, political issues, but even if they want to have a strategy to reach out to the Hispanic community in their community, or they would just love to hear you and others of your group come and speak. I certainly have valued the work that you've done, and I just appreciate you coming together with us today right here on this 4th of July weekend coming up.
Well, thank you so much. I would be absolutely honored to be with anyone, and also I was honored to be with you today. So thank you, and happy 4th of July to everybody that's listening.
Let me again recommend that his website is TonySuarez.com. You can get a copy of his book, The Triumphant Church, The Greatest Hope for the World. And, of course, I mentioned that it's a forward by Sammy Rodriguez, and Reverend Samuel Rodriguez has been on the program with us as well. And as I mentioned, we're coming to the 4th of July weekend here, and I know some of the stations may not join us the next hour, so you might tomorrow pay attention to my commentary, which talks about the origin of the Declaration of Independence. And even today, my commentary on the two types of society. Do we want a society that actually provides the greatest amount of freedom and at the same time provides a mechanism by which we can resolve some of these conflicts like DACA? Or do we want to move towards a totalitarian situation, which we've seen sometimes out there in the streets? So again, my commentary today and my commentary tomorrow are really an aim at reminding us, and maybe you can use this to remind your children and your grandchildren. Maybe you can send these as emails to them about the founding of this country and why these very important principles of a republic are key. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that the next hour we're going to talk about Messiah in the Passover. I'm really looking forward to that and getting away from some of the political stuff. But we do have that matching fund on the table. As Warren Kelly just mentioned a minute ago, a dollar for dollar match. And so if you'd like to give $50, it becomes $100. $100 becomes $200, and during the break, you can give us a call, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or, of course, the website is pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about Messiah in the Passover, and that is a new book that has come out, and we thought that this would be just a great break in many cases from what has been happening in the news, and also very important in terms of something else we like to talk about here in terms of biblical interpretation. Most of us do not come from a Jewish background. We come from a Gentile background, and so when we read various things in 1 Corinthians, certainly in the book of Hebrews, it harkens back, of course, to the Old Testament, and I think this is helpful. When we engage in the Lord's Supper, of course, we need to understand that context. And then more importantly, if we want to reach out to our Jewish friends and neighbors and co-workers, sometimes during Passover, there's a Seder that might take place. It provides just some great evangelistic opportunities. So for many reasons, I am just thrilled with this book, which is actually co-edited by Mitch Glaser, Dr. Mitch Glaser, as well as Dr. Darrell Bach. And Mitch Glaser, if you're not familiar, is a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary. He's also the president of Chosen People Ministries. He speaks quite a bit and writes quite a bit on Jewish evangelism, on Messianic Judaism, and he and Darrell Bach, who of course has been in studio with us many times before, have put this book together, which actually includes a number of individuals that have written various chapters. And if nothing else, Dr. Mitch Glaser, you start out by saying that this book is kind of a labor of love, isn't it?
It was a labor of love, Kerby. It was a labor of love for me and for Dr. Bach, who is also a Jewish believer and actually on our board. And we've collaborated now on 5 books with Kriegel and in their academic series. And this one is really special because instead of going with tried and true scholars, we picked out some of the best Chosen People staff members, all seminary graduates who have good academic capability, present Messiah in the Passover at churches all over the country, but they probably never wrote a chapter for a book. And so we did this. It took a year to put the whole book together, and Darrell took us, we were in L.A., we were there for about 3.5 hours, and he treated it like a doctoral symposium. And we just critiqued one another and rewrote. And then we took a long time to edit it a little further. And I think we've come up with not just a great book biblically and academically, but it's also a book that's filled with people who have experience talking to both Gentile Christians and Jewish believers and unbelievers about Jesus as the fulfillment of the Passover.
Again, you might be able to find the book at your local bookstore. It's published by Kriegel, but we've got a link so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. It has some sections on biblical foundations, so we're going to kind of camp out there for a little bit, and then the Passover during church history, then a little bit on Jewish traditions and even the communication of it, even some of the controversy involved with it. And if you want a practical book, it even has a section here on Passover foods and recipes and things of that nature, and then about 9 dependencies. Everything you'd probably want to know and more is in this book. So, Dr. Mitch Glaser, let's start off, because one of the introductions is about why study the Passover in the first place. And I think we've already elucidated a few reasons why, but help us understand why this is so crucial, especially for some of our listeners that are Gentiles saying, well, I'm not Jewish, and I really hardly ever talk to any Jewish people. But what about this?
Kerby, when I was first thinking about Jesus, when I was barely 19 years old, my two best Jewish friends came to faith out in San Francisco, although we were all born and bred New Yorkers. But some of your listeners might remember what a hippie was like. Anyway, so I was like a hippie. And this is 1970, right in the apex of the Jesus movement. And we were in San Francisco. My two best friends got saved. And I began thinking about Jesus, but I was raised in a more traditionally Orthodox Jewish home, not very religious, but Orthodox. So that's all we knew about Judaism. I'd never been to a Reform or conservative synagogue before. And I prayed and asked God to show me the truth. And believe it or not, I found a New Testament in a phone booth, if people remember what phone booths are like. And there it was, sitting there, kind of glowing in the moonlight. And I had prayed, God, show me the truth, because I was just so confused. And there was a copy of Good News for Modern Man by the Bible Society. And I picked it up and I guess I stole the book. So I was borrowing it, really. And so I took the book, I began reading it. And I was raised in the kind of New York Jewish home that I knew that Jesus was probably Catholic, in my opinion. And I had no clue. And I kept reading it because my friends' lives were really transformed. And I was thunderstruck because I began looking for all the times Jesus celebrated Christmas and all the times he celebrated Easter, because that's the way we evaluate other people's religions, by the festivals sometimes. And, lo and behold, he celebrated all the Jewish holidays. And he celebrated Passover every single year from a child until his death. And, of course, his death was very, very Passover-centric. And so when I read that, I realized that I was dealing with a Jewish person. Now, if you look at the pictures of Jesus throughout history, he usually looks Swedish, not even Italian. And so basically every picture of Jesus and everything about Christianity is a big red flag that says to Jewish people, stay out, foreign territory. And so this broke down for me when I began looking at Jesus as the Jewish, underline that 3 times, Messiah. And so seeing Jesus through Jewish eyes, which is the way it was written because the New Testament writers were all Jewish. So understanding that caused me to be, I realized it was me and wrestling with another Jew. And so it just changed the argument, changed the wrestling match. And I think it's very important for our spiritual lives to see the Bible through Jewish eyes. It's important for every Gentile Christian for their enrichment, and it's important for a Jewish person so that they could see that believing in Jesus is not something foreign.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of the various sections. We'll spend a little bit of time on the biblical foundations, the Passover in the Torah and the writings of prophets, but even then taking it into the New Testament, and then maybe just a little bit on some of the issues of church history and Jewish traditions and the celebration of the Messiah and the Passover, because if you have ever been to one of these seders that have been put on by various Messianic Jewish groups, you will say, it's all right there. But again, sometimes our Jewish friends can't see it. And so I think you're going to really enjoy this book. And we're going to spend some time today talking with Dr. Mitch Glaser, trying to educate all of us. And again, I've said, I don't know how you can make sense of some of the New Testament books without having an understanding of the Old Testament and what is actually being taught there. So we're going to get into that in some detail. And I hope that you will stay with us through the entire program. And maybe afterwards you might say, I'd like to listen to it again, or I'd like to pass it on to someone. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, and you can download the podcast or even watch it again on our YouTube channel. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation about the Messiah in the Passover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we approach the traditional time in America for which we celebrate its independence, it's worth considering two types of political society that we find in the world. The first is what we celebrate. We begin with the idea that government is instituted by human beings to provide liberty and security. We need enough government to ensure that we are safe, but we don't want so much government that we lose our freedom. Ben Shapiro talks about this in his editorial on our totalitarian moment. He explains that in this form of government, we agree not to infringe on another's life, liberty, and property, and we create a government capable of preventing or prosecuting such infringements. We may disagree with one another on key issues, but we allow the system of government to provide a means of resolving disputes. The second view requires purification. The goal is homogeneity instead of diversity. This is enforced by people with power whose goal is unity through coercion. We see this type of government in various totalitarian governments in the past and in many governments around the world today. We also see this type of society ruthlessly applied by the political left. In some cases, they hold the reins of political power. In other cases, they exert their totalitarian influence through the academy, the media, or popular culture. My commentary yesterday was yet one more reminder that even the slightest deviation from leftist standards can put you on the liberal blacklist. Public shaming, lawsuits, and a cancel culture are just a few of the tools used to enforce unity and political purity. As we celebrate the 4th of July this weekend, let's remind ourselves that freedom and diversity is our goal, not a coerced unity and a form of totalitarianism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
The book is entitled Messiah in the Passover. It is edited by Darrell Bach and Mitch Glaser, and Dr. Mitch Glaser with us today. Might say that this book really helps you understand kind of the historical understanding of the Passover, maybe even gives you a little bit of a Jewish and church history look at this as well. If you find yourself saying, well, yes, 350 pages, there's a lot of material in there, but I'd like even more, you can go to messiahandthepassover.com. There's all sorts of other resources and instructional videos. This is just an incredible work, and I hope that you will use this right now in your studies, but of course, if you want to use this in an evangelistic way, you'll find some great material there as well. Dr. Mitch Glaser, let's, if we can, set the scene, and that is the first whole section, of course, deals with Passover in the Torah. Kind of give us the background if you can.
Sure. Well, the Passover, the first Passover, was one that I was not there, but I was very happy for it because I probably wouldn't have enjoyed growing up as a slave in Egypt. It's bad enough I had to be born in Brooklyn and raised in New York City, you know? and so we all understand that the first Passover was really a formative experience for the children of Israel. They were in Egypt 400 years, and they were led out of Egypt by Moses, accompanied by awesome signs and wonders and plagues, and including pestilence, the Hebrew word dever. And so pestilence goes back a long way. Now, a bunch of us understand pestilence a little bit more. And so they were they crossed the Red Sea, and they observed Passover, and when they got into the land to commemorate the redemption from Egypt. And so there are actually two parts to what's usually called Passover. Well, most people look at it as one, but even in Judaism, we look at it as one, but it's really two. And you find those delineated in Leviticus chapter 23. In Leviticus 23, God says through Moses in verse 4, these are the Moedim, the appointed times, the holy appointments of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the times appointed for them. Very important phrase there, Kerby, because you can't exactly celebrate a Jewish festival whenever you feel like it. Passover, there is it's unusual, but there is a bit of an exception made for Passover later on in the Old Testament, but it was a very minor one. And Jewish people who were not able to celebrate the Passover were allowed to celebrate it a month later. That's the only instance we see in that. But it must be celebrated when it's supposed to be celebrated, and that's on the 14th day of the Hebrew month Nisan. And Nisan is not a car, it's a Hebrew month. And Nisan is the first month of the Jewish year. And usually that falls out somewhere between March and April. And so in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, which means, and then it says at twilight is the Lord's Passover, because in Judaism, we always begin the day the evening before.
Yes.
That's very important for those of you who are trying to figure out the chronology of the last week of Jesus' life, which was my chapter in the book, on the Passover book. And on the 15th day of the same month, there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, so there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you have Passover, the sacrifice of the lamb, looking back to the spotless, unblemished lamb in Exodus 12, whose blood was smeared on the doorpost and lintel of the house. And then the plague passed over the Jewish home, and the firstborn males were not slain, and that led to the redemption from Egypt. So that was one day, and it's always celebrated as one day. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that is celebrated for 7 days, and that's when we eat matzah. And so we wrap those two holidays up. We usually just call it Passover, and we actually eat matzah, believe it or not, for 8 days. You don't even get a day reprieve, you know? And I always meet Gentile Christians who love matzah, but that's because they didn't grow up having to eat it every year.
That's right.
And anyway.
But again, all this is continued on because you are in Leviticus, you have Numbers, you have a number of other chapters here about that. But then this continues on, of course, through the prophets and all the way into the New Testament. And I think that's striking, if nothing else, Dr. Glaser, because you can't think of too many other traditions that come from the ancient Near East that anybody practices today, but any Jew around the world throughout the various millennia have practiced Passover, and that is significant in itself, isn't it?
Very much so. Well, it's not only Passover, of course, as you understand. There are 7 great festivals over the course of the year, and one great festival every week, the Sabbath. And the Greek poet Manetho called the Jewish people a bunch of lazy people because they took off on Saturday. We think that God invented the 5-day work week. Not quite. And but anyway, so yes, Passover for the Jewish people is probably the most celebrated of all the Jewish festivals. It's even more than Hanukkah, which is not one of the 7 great festivals in Leviticus 23, but a lot of people love Hanukkah and celebrate Hanukkah. And so, yes, Jewish people are very unique in that we have kept our Torah-based culture throughout the centuries. And there's a lot of rabbinic tradition as to why that happened. But if you look at rabbinic tradition and even more secular types of Jewish looks at this phenomena, you will find that probably one of the reasons why Jewish people have kept the Passover and why Jewish people have kept so many of the other great festivals is because of suffering. There's nothing like, and Christians know this, you know, there's nothing like persecution to help affirm your identity as unique. And so you either believe it or you don't, because if you do, you're going to pay a price for it. And Jews have paid a price for keeping Passover and staying unique throughout the ages.
Let's talk about the New Testament. Darrell Bach wrote the Passover in the Gospel of Luke. You wrote the Passover in the Gospel of John. But your point is, the Gospel of John is really critical to understanding the Jewish story of Jesus. And as you said, you picked up the New Testament and expected to see Christmas and Easter. Instead, you saw the Feast of Booths, you saw the Passover, you saw all sorts of various Jewish issues, and in particular, the culmination before the crucifixion of Christ is what today we call the Last Supper. But how does that connect to the Passover itself?
Yeah. Well, be sure to read the book, because I pulled half my hair out writing this chronology on based on the Gospel of John.
Yes.
Darrell and I consulted all the way through the writing of this to make sure that we were at least on the same page, because a lot of scholars will say that there is a difference between Luke and John, but those of us who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible and that it's one great, wonderful, unified story are always trying to harmonize these truths, and it's really not too hard if you put the work into it. And so here's what I believe, Kerby, and you can read Darrell's chapter and read my chapter. You'll get all the plethora of details. We believe that Jesus celebrated the Passover as he was raised and as he was commanded as a Jewish man, beginning on the evening of the 14th day of Nisan. And we believe that would have been Thursday night. And then evening and morning, so Friday was still the 14th of Nisan, and he died and was in the grave at least a portion of 3 days and 3 nights. That's a whole other topic, but that's my point of view. And then he was raised on the day after the Sabbath, which would have been Sunday, which also, by the way, was a day of another festival, the Festival of First Fruits.
Yes.
And so that's why Paul calls Jesus the first fruit from among the dead. And then, of course, coincidentally, 50 days later, we celebrate the festival of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, the 50th day. And it was on that day that the Holy Spirit empowered those 120 Jewish disciples and others to go out and to reap the rest of the harvest. And we've been doing that ever since that day in the power of the Holy Spirit.
Very good.
One beautiful, prophetic, cohesive plan fulfilled in Jesus, and all that he said and did and continues to be fulfilled to his disciples.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we have a lot more to cover because we have the Passover and the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians could be called a Passover epistle, so how does that connect up? So we'll get into some of that, then we'll talk about the early church, and we're not going to avoid it. There were some Passover controversies in church history, so we'll talk about that too, and talk about practical aspects of that. So we have a lot more to cover. Absolutely fascinating book, Messiah in the Passover, and we'll be back right after this.
Conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation today on Messiah in the Passover. It is edited by Darrell Bach and Mitch Glaser. And Dr. Mitch Glaser is, of course, the president of Chosen People Ministries. This book is published by Kriegel. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've got a link to it there. And again, we're going to get into some of the things in the New Testament. We'll get into church history. Matter of fact, it relates very much to a booklet I've written recently on anti-Semitism, blood libel, and a few other things. We'll talk about all of that in just a minute. And again, we have information about this book as well as Chosen People Ministries on our website, pointofview.net. So let's get into the New Testament, because our listeners out here might say, I've never been to a Passover Seder, but I've been to a lot of Lord's Supper communion. But when you get to 1 Corinthians and you look at Paul and his feasts and the idea of the Messiah of the Passover, help us understand how this connects up to 1 Corinthians, which we quote so often when we're doing communion.
All right, so let's read it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. For remember, Paul was Jewish. So I didn't realize that after I was saved a year, and I finally recognized Paul was Jewish. St. Paul didn't sound like a very Jewish name to me. So, for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is also the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." And so there we have probably the most commonly read passage linking the Lord's Supper and Passover. And if you go back to Luke 22, for example, you have more details, because beginning at verse 1, really, if you read Luke 22, 1, all the way through verse 23, you get a lot more information about the Passover. And if you read through the Upper Room Discourse in the Gospel of John, you get even more, John 12 and following, you get even more information about the Passover, so that you put together a composite picture. So let me just tell you what is happening. And what was so interesting to me, because I was raised in a traditional Jewish home, is when I read this in the Gospels. I remember when I first read it in the Gospels, I said, wow, that's what we do. And I'm thinking that Jesus was, the son of the Pope, so this is what we do. That was pretty much a jump. So let me explain. Passover is celebrated and has been celebrated for thousands of years by Jewish people through what we call a Seder, S-E-D-E-R. It's the Hebrew word which means order. If you go to Israel and bump into somebody, learn how to say Beseder, in order, or it's okay. And it refers to the liturgy. And the liturgy is found in one of the many Jewish prayer books, this one specifically for Passover, called the Haggadah. Haggadah is a Hebrew word which means the telling. And it is the telling of the story of redemption. It basically is the narrative in Exodus 12 and or actually Exodus 9 through 12 and following, where we tell the whole story of how God delivered the Jewish people. Now, the Passover Seder is really designed for children, so there are some parts where we demonstrate, taste, touch, eat foods, drink wine, do all sorts of things to engage the kids. And everything has symbolic meaning. And so we take 4 cups of wine at Passover, and those 4 cups of wine have names. And the first one is called blessing, the second plagues, the third redemption, which is after the meal, and the fourth is the cup of praise, or the hallelujah, praise the Lord cup. And what we understand is that Jesus took the cup after he had eaten, which means he took the cup of redemption, which reminds us of the smeared blood of the innocent, perfect lamb on the doorpost of the Jewish home that allowed the Jewish young men to be saved. And so Jesus didn't pick any cup. He picked the cup of redemption. And then he also didn't just take some odd piece of bread at a banquet and eat it. That bread, and read it, even though the Greek word is artos, it's still matzah. It's bread, generically bread. And what we do with that bread, the matzah, is we put 3 pieces into a little pouch, and the pieces generally represent God, the priests, and the people. So the middle piece is the piece of the priest. We take that piece of matzah, which is striped and pierced and made without leaven, a symbol of sin. We break it, we hide one piece, we put the other piece in the pouch, send the kids off at the end of the meal to find that missing piece of matzah, which is now called the apikomen, a Greek word. How it snuck into the Seder, we're not sure. But apikomen, which means that which comes later. And after you give the child a little bit of a reward for finding this, you then break off a piece of that matzah, distribute it to everybody at the table, and we all eat. So what's the symbolism of that? Well, very simple. Jesus took the middle piece of matzah because he was the priest in sacrifice. He broke it because he would be broken in death the next day on Friday. And then he wrapped it as he would be wrapped. He hid it as he was to be buried. He brought it back as he would rise from the dead, and distributed it as he would give his life to all who would believe. That, dear friends, is the symbolism of the Lord's Supper. This Lord's Supper grew in the soil or the garden of the Passover. And so when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we're really celebrating the fulfillment of Passover.
I can't help but having thought that there are a lot of people who would like to have you come and do that Passover Seder at their home or in their church, because that went into such great detail. But I'm going to keep it moving because we haven't even covered half of the book, and there's a whole section here about this not only being instituted, certainly through the first situation of the church and through 1 Corinthians, but then also this continues on in the early church and then into church history. So talk about that, because now you have Jews doing a Passover, but you also have Christians doing a communion or a Lord's Supper, whatever it might be called, sort of almost on parallel tracks. And, of course, the Christians do that when they gather together in the early church. But eventually, in church history, there was a question as to, does the church practice the Passover, or does it practice the whole issue of the Lord's Supper? Speak to that, if you might.
Yeah, I think it goes to a deeper issue, which I know you're very well aware of. And it goes to the issue of replacement theology. Now, let me just tell you quickly what that is. It basically means that you believe that the church has replaced Israel, which means that God has no future for Israel. We understand that future for Israel is always in Christ. And it refers to Romans 11:25 and following, Zechariah 12:10, many other passages which testify to what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 11, that the day is coming when the remnant of Israel will encompass the nation, because the nation, all who are alive at that time, of Jewish people, will embrace Jesus as their Savior. So in no way am I suggesting that there are grand blessings for the Jewish people outside of Jesus. I will say that the covenant God made with Abram in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, the Abrahamic covenant, stands the test of time. I believe it's an unconditional covenant, not dependent upon man, but dependent upon God. I think God made that point in Genesis 15, when Abram split the animals and God walked through the animals, a process of making a covenant. God did that by himself while Abram was asleep and having a very realistic dream. And so we understand that God has a continued plan for the nation of Israel. And the great part of that plan is that Jews will turn to Jesus. Now, there are a lot of promises for the Jewish people. And so God has not replaced the Jewish people. In a sense, he has fulfilled everything the Jewish people hoped for and longed for in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, both in his first coming in fulfillment, for example, of Isaiah 53, and his second coming in fulfillment of so many other passages. What happened in the early church is there was, well, let's just say there was some competition. had the destruction of the temple. You had Jewish people out in the diaspora now. You also had the followers of Jesus, who were Jewish at first, out in the diaspora, and they were all fighting for souls, so to speak. And conversion was actually welcomed at that time by Gentiles to Judaism. And the synagogue became more prominent than the temple, of course, after 70 AD when it was destroyed.
Let me jump in real quick because we have to have one of those mandatory breaks, and I don't want to interrupt. So we'll go to the break first. Then we'll come back and continue our conversation with Mitch Glaser, kind of explaining that whole part of church history. It's a very good section in this book, and we'll continue right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Messiah in the Passover, edited by Darrell Bach and Mitch Glaser. Dr. Mitch Glaser with us. And we won't, of course, cover all of the book, but I thought, Dr. Glaser, you were doing a good job of helping us understand what kind of unfolded in the early church and in church history, especially with the destruction of the temple, the Jews scattered in the diaspora. There were some things that developed in terms of attitudes towards the Passover that are, of course, sad chapters in our history, but it's certainly something we need to talk about, isn't it?
Right. So basically, there are a number of early church controversies, and the church was very sensitive. I think there was competition between the early church and the growing dynamic Jewish movement that became more universal because it didn't need a temple anymore. And I think that the church became very sensitive to the term Judaizing and cast a negative, sort of a negative point of view on keeping any Jewish traditions. And so basically the church was saying that Jesus is the Messiah, Jews are rejected, they rejected Jesus, and all Jewish traditions are no longer valid. What's valid now are church traditions, and so the Lord's Supper, communion in its many formats, became very important to the church. And at Nicaea, the church divorced itself from the Jewish calendar. And that was a very significant move. And so that's why, Kerby, there are years when we celebrate Easter before Passover, and that's a pretty strange experience. And so what happened is that the church grew increasingly non-Jewish and anti-Jewish and actually anti-Semitic as the years went by. I'm sure that you covered that in some of your booklet, which I'd love to read. And so that's what we have. And so it could have been very different. It could have been, the church could have said, this is the blessed fulfillment of Passover. Let's learn about the Passover. Let's celebrate the Lord's Supper. And everybody would have been enriched. But there was just such a chasm developed between Israel and the church, and between Passover and the Lord's Supper, that now most evangelical Christians really don't understand the Jewish backgrounds of the Passover. So we're making up for 2,000 years of lost time.
Good reason to read the book. And just in the few minutes we have left, there's a whole section on communicating the gospel through the Passover, the gospel and the Passover Seder, Jesus, the Lamb of God, the third cup. Can you give us kind of a summary? Because one of the many benefits of this book, and there are many, not only helping us understand the history and even some of the practical material here about the various courses and the recipes and all of that, if you wanted to actually put one together, is it is just a great evangelistic opportunity. And so many times we've tried to focus on how you can share the gospel with your Jewish friends, neighbors, and coworkers. And you have a whole section in the book talking about how to communicate the gospel through the Passover. Can you give us kind of a brief summary of that?
Sure, Kerby, it's my favorite chapter. And I picked a nice Dallas Seminary graduate to write it.
I saw that.
And
yeah.
And basically, good evangelism starts with what other people know. Jesus was the master teacher. He started with farming illustrations and natural illustrations and illustrations from everyday Jewish life. So if you can find a bridge or a redemptive parallel, with your Jewish friend, it's great. So you read Exodus, if you're an evangelical Christian, a born-again Christian, you read the Old Testament, you read the book of Exodus, and you read the book of Isaiah. And so you can speak to your Jewish friend about the symbolism in the Passover of redemption. And I always like to say that the picture of the door of the Jewish home dripping with the blood of the Lamb is a prophetic portrait of what was to come when the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world, shed his blood for our sins. And therefore, by faith, our hearts, just like the ancient Israelites' doors, can be covered by the shed blood of the perfect Lamb of God. And that's how we can get forgiveness of sin. And so these are at least pictures that make sense. But one of the things that I would do is I would take what I call the innocent Gentile approach. And I would say that if you have a Jewish friend and you actually don't have to wait for Passover. September, we've got the high holidays, New Year's, Day of Atonement, and Tabernacle, so you can start early. And so you want to say, can you tell me more about this holiday? I read about it in the Old Testament, and they'll say, you mean the Bible, because Jews, of course, have no New Testament. But I read about it in the Old Testament, and I'm wondering if you can explain more about this holiday to me and come up with some good questions from the text. And what happens then is you switch the tables. You turn the tables, because not in a bad way, but in a very good way, Because now you're asking your Jewish friend to help teach and mentor you. And Jewish people are really sensitive about Christians coming on too strong and telling them what they should and shouldn't believe. But if you can turn the tables and say, listen, I really love these holidays because I study that Bible also, but I have a lot of questions because I wasn't raised in a Jewish home. Can you help me better understand it? If you can get that posture into your mind and heart, that'll make such a big difference in sharing the gospel with your Jewish friends.
Very good. Again, we have a link to chosenpeople.com, which is a great resource as well. And if you want to get a copy of the book from there, you can. We've also got a link. Very good video where you can watch for about 4 minutes Dr. Glaser explain a little bit of evangelism and those kinds of issues, and it certainly is a great organization to support, and we've talked about it many times when we've had Dr. Darrell Bach in studio, and I've sent support to it as well. And of course, he is the president of Chosen People Ministries and one of the editors of this incredible book, Messiah in the Passover. It is, of course, published by Kriegel Books as well as by Chosen People Ministries. And so, Dr. Mitch Glaser, I really appreciate you joining us today and educating us. We haven't even come close to covering all the material in the book, but that's a good reason for people to go get a copy. And I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, I know you lead probe, so you did some really wonderful probing questions, my brother.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and Lord bless you. Stay safe and healthy.
Just before we go, let me just mention again, we do have a link there, and Messiah in the Passover is really for any of you that would like to explore some of the traditions of the Passover, to maybe, as we've talked about today, the links between the Passover and the Last Supper and the communion. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to maybe put on one of these, this would be a great evangelistic opportunity. It has Passover recipes and lessons, but also there's a link to MessiahInThePassover.com, which gives you additional resources and some videos. So I would hope that you would take the time to go to those resources as well. But if you'd like a copy of the book, it is all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let me just mention now, just before we take a break, that indeed we are going to tomorrow play a tape on July 30th. My commentary tomorrow will be on the origins of the Declaration of Independence. And I hope that during this 4th of July weekend, you'll take the time to enjoy your family, but also, as we started off of the program an hour ago, be safe, use common sense, and let's see if we can, certainly in the midst of this pandemic, not increase the number of individuals that become infected. So again, I hope that this will be a special weekend for you. Looking forward to, again, live programs on Monday, and if you find yourself wanting to know more about all of these issues, go to the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.